Okay, I gotta say, it's kind of nice having a native plant meeting when there's not like an imminent hurricane coming right for us. It's a nice welcome change. Could have been very different too, right? We had that one that was like scheduled to hit us like today. But along those same lines, we don't have too much going on this time of year. We are looking at possibly implementing a grant program to replace individual trees for homeowners. So people that have lost trees in a hurricane, they can replace it with something native as opposed to something from Home Depot or not replace it at all. So that we're going to have more details on that next month. But I appreciate everybody coming in person. We are kind of doing a little watch party tonight where we have an in-person contingent here at Selby Gardens and then a bunch of people watching from home as well. So with that, without further ado, we'll go ahead and introduce our speaker tonight. So we have a great speaker tonight from Archbold Biological Station. His name is Dr. Aaron David, and he is the program director of plant ecology at Archbold. He got his Ph.D. at the University of Minnesota, and he's been working in the Florida ecosystems for the last 8 years. His research interests include plant population ecology, plant microbe interactions, and biological control of invasive plants. And that has to do more with his topic today, where he's going to be telling us how he manages plants with native and invasive plant management at Archbold Biological Station. So without further ado, Aaron, the floor is yours.
All right. Well, thank you for that introduction.
Oh, 1 second, Aaron. I can't hear you on my side. Let me mess with my audio here.
Hello, hello. Can you hear me?
1 second. Okay, one more time.
Can you hear me now? Hello.
Yeah, okay, we're good now.
All right. I can start. Well, are we good? Yeah.
Let's see. See if I can move closer to the Wi-Fi.
Sorry, was that a yes? You can hear me okay?
Okay. Yeah, we can hear you now.
Okay. Well, thank you for that introduction, and thanks for the invitation to speak with you guys. I guess maybe first off, I won't be talking about the invasive stuff today. I'll just be focusing on most of what we do in the Archbold Plant Ecology program with the native species. But if anyone has some questions about some of the invasive work that we do, I'm happy to answer some questions at the end. So today I'm happy to share just a bit about the work that we do here on looking at the endemic plants of the Lake Wales Ridge, the demography that we do, management and conservation, as well as just show you some cool plants that we have on the Lake Wales Ridge in anticipation of the field trip on Saturday, which you guys will hopefully get to see some of these species, although not all of them are at Archbold. All right. Let's make sure this works. All right. Hopefully you guys see that change of slide. Just let me know if something is not working. So I'd like to start talks just kind of showing this image of what ancient Florida looked like when sea level was a lot higher. Florida was just this series of barrier islands, which are now ridges. And as sea levels would drop, Florida would expand beyond what it is now. The species would move around. Sea level would go back up, and then they'd be only the ones on the ridges would survive. So we have a series of these ridges, and the almost the most southern, at least in central Florida, is the Lake Wales Ridge. And at that southern tip of the Lake Wales Ridge is where we're located at our Archbold Biological Station. For those that aren't familiar with us, we are a nonprofit research institute. We're a field station. We have a roughly 5,000 acre scrub preserve and about 15,000 other acres of working lands. And so where we work here in Florida is today what is known as the headwaters of the Everglades. So this is the the water system that feeds into Lake Okeechobee and then into the Everglades. We work in a series of both privately held lands, including Archbold, as well as some probably by TNC, as well as the federal and state properties that are kind of in our area. The ridge itself is about 160 kilometers long, or roughly about 100 miles long, 8 miles wide, and it is full of sand, as you may well know. What does it look like? This is a typical fire lane, kind of going through Archbold. So this is a nice image of what some of our flatwoods looks like. When I give this talk to other audiences, they often haven't seen flatwoods, but you all may very well be familiar with it out in Sarasota. So lots of palmettos, especially saw palmetto. We also have scrub palmetto, as well as pines, mainly slash pine. And then in our high elevation, we have sand pines and lots of oak species as well. So here's one of our key habitats that we have, which is called rosemary scrub. This is high elevation habitat, named for its the dominant rosemary, Florida rosemary. I don't know if you guys can see. Actually, you know what? I can put the pointer on. Let's put this pointer on. All right, hopefully you guys can see the pointer. So it's named for the namesake species, the Florida rosemary, Serratiola ericoides. You have plenty of that in this habitat, plenty of interspersed oaks and Lyonias, and then lots of this bare open sand, where we have a lot of endemic species, many of which are endangered, federally listed, state listed, or just otherwise restricted to this real open habitat surrounding the rosemary. And then, of course, we have some other non-plant species of interest, including sand skinks and the Florida scrub jay. So plenty of those, and you'll hopefully, well, you probably won't see any sand skinks because they're very difficult to see, but you will hopefully get to see some Florida scrub jays when you visit. Archbold's plant ecology program. So I'm the program director of this. We focus in 3 major areas. The first is population ecology. So basically the science of how populations increase, decrease, or otherwise change. The conservation science, so a very related idea of how we can sort of manipulate that population ecology to conserve the species of interest. And then just generally biodiversity research, documenting a lot of the biodiversity that we have here on the Lake Wales Ridge and surrounding areas. And of course, these aren't really isolated topics, and there's a lot of interchange between them. So one of the key approaches that we take is this long-term monitoring approach, what's referred to as demographic monitoring, or just plant demography. So the key here is that we will tag individual plants and then follow them throughout the life cycle. So this allows us to measure what are known as population vital rates. So these are the kind of indicators of the species of how well it's doing. So this includes things like recruitment, either by seedlings or by clonal recruits, survival of those plants, annual year-to-year growth, and then a measure of reproductive output. And these vital rates can be looked at on their own. They can be incorporated into larger population models, all sorts of stuff we can do with this. Just to give you a quick example or overview of all the things that we do. This is not all we do, but these are some of the species that we monitor. So many of them are federally or state listed, although not every one of them. And then we kind of have various projects that are focused on these, and I'm going to talk about many of them tonight. So the first part of this talk is going to focus on saving the rarest of the rare. So this is one of our big conservation pillars that we have at Archbold. We really focus on these rare species, and the goal is population persistence. We want to see populations persist so we can ensure that the species can survive. And I'll start with one of the rarest plants that we work with, which is the Avon Park harebells, Crotalaria avonensis. This is a very diminutive plant. It's known from very few places on the Lake Wales Ridge. It's known as a Lake Wales Ridge endemic, but that's not really telling the whole story. It's actually only found in 3 places in the wild. So here's kind of a map of where they are, and it's really just that like boundary between Avon Park and Sebring. So it's incredibly limited geographically. And that's just one of the things it has going against it. In addition, one of these three, so two of these three populations are protected. One of them over at Avon Park Lakes is an unprotected population that has been declining over the last 2 decades. We were out there pretty recently, and it's doing even worse than this figure, which was from 2022. And time is really running out to rescue the plants in this population. And unfortunately, even though these other two are protected, one of them isn't even totally protected. This Carter Creek site, this is a state property. And it's one of these state properties, which is known as a mega parcel. And unfortunately, these mega parcels have a lot of privately held in-holding properties, and people will develop their property. And in this case, there was a house that went up right just about 20 feet away from our population, so very, very close by. And so even in these reserves, these populations aren't safe. It really restricts the ability to get fire in. So fire is going to be a really important theme throughout this talk. It's incredibly important to the management. And when you start having development, that will really restrict the ability to actually implement fire. But we've been working to help save this species. Just a couple of the introductions that happened back in 2012 and then again in 2015. So these use a combination of seeds that were collected from the wild populations as well as transplants. These transplants were propagated in a mix of actually tissue culture and then also cuttings from those tissue cultured plants. And we recently analyzed the data that came from this, and this introduction, particularly from 2012, really has taken off. So the original transplants are in black, and then the gray ones are the different recruits, either by seedlings or by clones. You can see really starting around 2017, it starts taking off, and then it's been pretty stable since then. So we feel fairly confident that we've been able to establish a fourth new population of Avon Park harebells, which is very important to the conservation of this species. And then we actually did another introduction at the same site, but a different parcel within the Silver Lake. So just to give you a few pictures from this exciting thing we did. So we were collecting plants cuttings from all three of the sites to have as genetically diverse population as we could. They're propagated from these cuttings at Bach Tower Gardens with a conservation program over there led by Cheryl Peterson. And then once they were ready to go, we brought them out to our site, planted them, and used these nice water boxes to help keep them wet during the drought, which started right away, unfortunately. And there's just a picture of the team. So far, these plants seem to be doing pretty well. Many of them have survived their first summer and fall, and so hopefully we're going to get another piece of this population established. The next of the rarest of the rare species is the Florida ziziphus, which is formerly Ziziphus salata or Pseudo-Ziziphus salata. This is a really interesting species. It was first collected in 1951 and by a botanist, and he didn't know what it was, so he kind of made a specimen, a voucher specimen, and it was stuck in a drawer. And then in the 80s, it was discovered in that drawer and described as a new species, which the closest relative is not anywhere near here. It's all the way out in California. And that's the only other Ziziphus species we have that's native to North America. But at the time that it was described in the 80s, it was thought to be extinct. But once it was described, it was actually discovered in the wild. And then it was discovered again and several more times. And to date, 17 populations have been discovered, of which 13 of them are still persisting. But there's a lot of challenges to this species. So this is an ancient slow growing shrub, and an emphasis on slow growing. It is one of the slowest growing species I've ever worked with. It can take decades for these plants to really get established at their new sites. And there's other challenges, including self-incompatibility. It has very low genetic diversity. It really only mates with certain mating types. So you have to have the right mating type for it to actually have successful mating and develop a fruit. And then once that happens, the recruitment from seeds is just very, very low. We've been leading a multi-institution effort to help save the species with Bok Tower Garden, as well as collaboration with Missouri Botanical Garden and Cincinnati Zoo and Botanical Gardens, as well as a lot of landowners, including TNC, Florida Forest Service, FWC, and U.S. Fish and Wildlife. And the idea is to create several new introduced populations, which can be self-sustaining, and actually save a lot of these wild populations, which in general, they're on unprotected properties and they're very, very small, and aren't really going to survive into the future. But the idea is that if we have these introduced populations, they can be genetically diverse and hopefully persist. So this is kind of what it looks like when you're transplanting it. I'll mention it is, it's a very slow growing species. It can be a little hard to love and it doesn't really seem to love you back. It's very prickly, both literally and metaphorically, in working with it. But it is a very cool one, and one certainly worth saving. So to date, we've done 11 experimental translocations. This involves over 1,000 transplants, and well over 20,000 seeds. And then talking about like what success is going to look like here, it's a few things. One is establishing many populations, of which we have about 6 going right now that seem to be successful. Within those, establishing high population numbers that can actually be self-sustaining. And then the last one, which is really the hardest one, is genetically diverse populations. And this is a really tricky one because we are not able to actually maintain a lot of these in ex situ planting beds at Bach. And so a big part of our research is trying to figure out how to get these these different genetic individuals into these populations. And that has continued to be a challenge. So the next group that I'll just mention are the Dicerandra mints or balms. So these are plants in the Lamiaceae. There are several of them that are found in Florida, and we work with three of them: Dicerandra thanicola, Christmanii, and frutescens. With frutescens being the one that we have here at Archbold on station. So these are part of this broader, roughly dozen or so Dicerandra species. Up in the north, they are generally annual plants. And then as you move further south, you get these perennials. And these perennials have incredibly restricted ranges. So I mentioned frutescens is found at Archbold and just like a couple other places. It basically goes from Archbold to the grocery store, and that's its entire range. Christmanii is actually the next one up. It's in Sebring and Avon Park. So you don't have to go very far to find a completely different species. And then Thanicola, which is the other one that we work with, is up in Titusville. And then also on the ridge, I'll mention we have Modesta, and then further up you get Densiflora and Cornutissima. But yeah, these are it's actually a very interesting story about the evolution of this genus, and it's one of the really cool stuff we have here in Florida that really just evolved on these ridges. And I'll mention, I mentioned this incredibly restrictive range. This is an example of Thanicola. So it's found in Titusville. This is the city of Titusville here. Over here is Merritt Island, and Space Center is over there somewhere. And where I have in that yellow circle is about roughly 85 to 90% of all known plants found right there in the middle of the city of Titusville. And that's pretty much it. As far as wild populations go, there are a few other scattered ones, but that's how restrictive of a range we're talking. And so we've done a lot of monitoring of these populations. I'll just highlight a few of the conservation efforts. So here's one from Dicerandra christmanii. This is the one native to Sebring and Avon Park. So we last did an augmentation back in 2019 by putting out a combination of transplants and seeds. This figure just basically shows the increase in the population from all transplants to seedlings coming up, and then this is from last year, updated last year, but now a good deal of them are flowering plants, and some of those transplants are still alive, still pumping out seeds, but a lot of those recruits are now flowering plants, which is great and exactly what you want to see for a successful introduction. And then Dicerandra Thunicula, example from our 2021 introduction. For this project, we've been working with the Brevard County EAL program. That's the Environmental Endangered Lands. It's a county program out there. They manage a number of properties and are excellent partners in a lot of this Dicerandra work. So with this introduction, we've seen really high survival of transplants. Roughly 3/4 of them survive that first fall out there. And then a lot of them are still alive. We've seen thousands and thousands of new seedlings. Pretty good survival. A lot of those are now flowering. And then I don't have a slide for this, but we did a new introduction just a few months ago, back in August. And we were actually just out there last week monitoring, and a good deal of them have survived and are flowering. So we're expecting to see a nice flush of seedlings, hopefully this spring. All right, so I'll shift gears and talk a little bit about management. So I mentioned earlier, fire is a really big, important piece of management. So we live in the Southeast, and for those that don't know, fire is just a pervasive force in the Southeast. To say that fire is important in our ecosystem is really just an undersell. Fire just historically, even pre-human, it was just going all the time. Like, things were always on fire back in this region. And a lot of those fires did occur, we think, in late May, early June. That's probably kind of the sweet spot, but a lot of them would just kind of like burn throughout the year. And of course, fire has been suppressed recently, and so all these plant species that really evolved in the context of being burned all the time have not been getting the fire that they need, and a lot of our habitat quality has suffered because of that. In particular, a lot of our work historically in this lab has focused on fire and rosemary scrub. So this is the scrub dominated by the Florida rosemary with a lot of the endemic species. It doesn't burn as frequently as other scrub habitats, and you can probably guess why. So fire needs vegetation to burn, and here you can see a lot of decently sized gaps that fire would have to cross to actually burn. And so rather than burning every, say, 3 to 5 years, like flatwoods often does, rosemary scrub will burn every 15 to roughly 60 years. But that fire is really important for maintaining viable populations of the endemic herbs that are colonizing and persisting in these gaps. And so our research can inform just how frequently we need to be burning. And so a couple examples of this. So the first on the left is the federally listed Eryngium quinifolium. There's a Lake Wells Ridge endemic, only found in Highlands County. And so what you can do is you can come up with some cool population models. And I won't get into the math too much, but basically you can look at the time since fire, and then populations that are increasing are up here and decreasing are down here. You can see that on average, they start decreasing around 10 years after a fire. So once you hit that mark, those populations will start to crash. And similarly for the Highlands St. John's wort Hypericum cumulicula, you see this boom around 3 to 6 years after fire on average, and then it starts to crash. And so this really informs just how frequently you should be burning if you want to maintain viable populations of these endemic species. I'll give another example. So this is Luden's milkwort, Polygula lutonii. This one isn't quite a ridge endemic. It is found a little bit further north as well, but it is a federally listed species. It's a really cool one. It has these very nice, showy, cosmogamous flowers. They're really beautiful. They flower in March. But then it also has these more subtle, less beautiful cleistogamous flowers, which remain closed. And that's not all. They also have underground flowers, which are cleistogamous flowers that don't open. but they're actually found underground. And so it has all three of these, with most of the seed production happening in these chasmogynous flowers, which can outcross, but in self-fertilization happening in these other flowers. And I really just have this to show that this is a species that loves fire. It's found in generally oak hickory or just sandhill type habitats. Um, and usually, but not always, we'll see these bursts after fire. So the red is a fire treatment. So you see general increases afterwards. This green one is actually a hardwood reduction treatment, and so we're seeing a burst a little bit after that. And this is one that as soon as that canopy opens up, it really booms. So as long as it's getting that fire that it needs, these populations can be secure. And I'll also mention one in your area, the Florida golden aster. This is Chrysopsis floridana. So this is one of several Chrysopsis species found in Florida. It was the only one to be federally listed, and there's a couple other state listed ones. Actually, one that was recently described by Jay Horn a year or two ago. So this is one, it was federally listed back in 1986. And the U.S. Fish and Wildlife funded a number of introductions, of which about 8 of them happened in the late 2000s, early 2010s, by Bach Tower Gardens. And that was part of the recovery effort to really try to establish new populations to supplement a lot of these wild ones, which were either tanking or just on unprotected property, or otherwise just not doing well. And Archbold got involved starting in 2017 to monitor these populations a little bit more closely using demographic monitoring. And one of the things that we found is that a lot of these introduced populations aren't doing particularly well, but that's really linked to whether they receive fire management. So the red ones in this case are the burned ones, and the blue ones are ones that were not burned during our study period. And so the big take home is that when you're burning these populations, they tend to increase more or less. And then the ones that don't burn tend to be really low or decreasing. And the other thing is, like, you have to continue this fire management for it to be successful. That is the key to maintaining this species, as well as a lot of other ones, is that they really need this continued fire management to persist. So some of you might be familiar with this species, but it was proposed for delisting in 2021. We sent in a letter during the public comment period, arguing that this was probably not a good idea, based on a number of things, including these decreasing populations. And basically, that didn't matter. They were pretty determined to delist it. According to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife and their delisting document, the habitat was acquired, plants were propagated and reintroduced on new sites and planted in strategic areas, bolstering and expanding populations. So that's what was in their delisting letter. And then a nice quote from this article that ran in the Tampa Bay Times. I don't know if Liz Childress is there. I'm not really sure who's in the audience today, but if any of you involved are here, you can speak up. But this quote, "Oh man, oh, this is not good. Our populations here are not that healthy." This was out at Weeden Island. But that really reflects what is going on with these populations. They aren't doing all that well. It was delisted a little prematurely in all of our minds. And that's just based on the science of what we're seeing out there. Now there is a post-monitoring delisting program, so there, which will be reviewed after 5 years, and it can be relisted if that is what they determine. But that's kind of where things stand right now. Okay, so I'm going to just wrap up the last section, just a little bit about the biodiversity work that we do. This is not the biggest thing we do, but we are on the Lake Wales Ridge, and there's surprisingly more biodiversity to be found and documented, even after all these years of people working here. So we maintain an herbarium with over 4,000 vascular plants, 1,800 bryophytes, over 200 lichens. Actually, that one's a little old, but we have more macrofungi, which I'll talk about in a second. This includes over 600 new vouchered collections that were made at an FWC property at Carter Creek recently. And all these are available online, scans of them, so people can take a look at what we have, use that for their research, or if they need to, they can contact us and access the specimen in person. And then the last thing I'll just touch on is some of our macrofungi. So this is really where we've been putting our efforts as far as biodiversity. This is an area that has really never been explored for its fungi. And so we have a new collection, new protocols for collecting, for storing them, and for extracting DNA. We've been working with Matt Smith, who's here in the center at University of Florida, to help us out with this. And so this is really part of a longer term effort to document a lot of the macrofungi that we have in our area. So just a summary. So our science helps save the rarest of the rare plants. Our long-term data can help lead to better management. And there's still a lot of biodiversity to be documented and understood on the Lake Wales Ridge. So I'll leave it there, and I'm happy to discuss any questions you guys might have. Yeah, thank you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Aaron. See if my headset works a little better. Yeah, so anybody online, feel free to unmute yourself and ask questions. In person, you can ask a question. I can just repeat it back to him. I had a question about just herbaceous flowers in general. When they are susceptible to fire, do they reproduce because the fires, they need that to produce viable seed, or because they need the space to actually grow?
Yeah, that's a great question. There are some species that really are stimulated by fire. So like wiregrass is one that comes to mind. The tissue themselves will burn. So just to be clear, so if there's a plant there and it burns up, that literal tissue will burn up. Now, what might happen next is that it will resprout and then immediately flower. So that happens with some species. With probably the majority of the ones that we work with, it's more about freeing up the space, reducing the shrub canopy cover, and just having that open space so that they can actually grow, that seedlings can successfully recruit and grow in that open area now.
Cool. Another question about the plant that flowers underground. How rare is that, and why would it do that?
Yeah, I can try to answer that. So it's federally listed. It's not the most rare species, but it does have a pretty restricted range. Kind of the northern Lake Wales Ridge, and it can go a little bit beyond that, a little bit north of that as well. It's the presence of cleistogamous flowers in general is kind of thought of as like a bed hedging strategy. So in times of not being able to outcross with another plant, there's ways for that plant to ensure its own survival by self-fertilizing with these cleistogamous flowers, and then definitely having some seed. And so I think the below ground part is really just like a natural extension of that. So it's really ensuring that those plants are that those flowers are going to be safe, and that it can produce some seed. So that would be my guess as to what's going on with that. Yeah, basically a bed hedging strategy. Let's see if anyone.
Was there a question in the chat there, Aaron?
Yeah, recommendations for potentially incorporating these species into certain landscapes. So a lot of these ones we are a little hesitant to do. So I'll mention the mints in particular, those Dyson Rancher mints. In some ways, it would be great to do it because they're actually pretty easy to grow. And once they start seeding, they can sustain a population decently well. One of the fears with the mints in particular is that they hybridize really easily. So there's a fear that if we start growing them just in like people's yards, that they'll get moved around the state and hybridize in ways that we don't really want them to. So that's one of the concerns there. Others, certainly some of the endangered shrubs, maybe could be propagated. Um, but there's that concern about just like moving them around too much. And because they have these restricted ranges, there's kind of a less of a desire to do that for that reason.
Yeah. The question from Julie is, what are the major invasives and invasives and how does Archbold manage them?
Yeah, so we're in the scrub. I won't say we're invasion proof, but we have less of a problem with invasives than other places. So I came from the USDA Invasive Plant Research Lab as a postdoc before starting this position. And I have not found a great opportunity to work into invasives because we just don't have all that many. It's like, I mean, we certainly do have some. So Natal grass is probably the biggest one in the scrub that we have. And it's mostly on the roadsides, and rarely gets inside the scrub habitat. But when it does, it can get pretty bad, especially if the soil's been disturbed or if there's been alterations like changing of pH. That's a big reason why the tall grass can get in. And we try to keep up with spraying as much as we can. In some cases, you can hand pull if you're just out and there's just like, you know, the occasional plant out there, then sometimes that's actually manageable to just hand pull. Some of the other ones we find, well, torpedo grass, Kogan grass, not so much on our property, although it's certainly in the area. Brazilian pepper, as well. And then in some of the wetter areas, like Lygodium microphyllum, old world climbing fern, which is actually my old species. I worked on biocontrol for over 3 years on that one, so I've seen some of the worst spots of that. But we only have a few areas on the station that are really bad as far as Lygodium go.
Any other questions from the in-person? Yep. Did you hear that, Aaron?
I didn't hear it, no.
The soils in the sand on the roseberry scrub is very sandy. It looks like a beach. So what kind of nutrients are in that sand that allow it to actually grow?
Very few. It has very low levels of nitrogen and phosphorus. And on top of that, it's very acidic. So some of those can be pHs of 5, or even 4s, and in some cases, especially in the flatwoods, they could be in the 3s. Which is not answering your question, I know, of how is it living there. But one of the theories is that these are plants that are able to withstand the acidity and withstand low nutrients in ways that other species aren't, and maybe they're just kind of there because they can survive it. Would be one reason. But yeah, it's a really harsh environment to be a plant.
In the rosemary, if there's a fire, they need fire to thrive and go through the generations. But if there's a fire, the plant actually dies. Is that correct?
That's correct. So, most of the almost all the shrubs out there are resprouters. They'll come back after a fire, but rosemary itself is not a resprouter. It is a reseeder. Those will die in the fire, and usually a year or two after the fire, you'll see a lot of rosemary recruitment. Yeah, and that's actually one of the reasons why the herbaceous plants can thrive out there, because they lose that canopy cover for longer and have a longer window to really grow and reproduce until that rosemary starts growing back.
Any other questions? Yeah, Leah.
And I can't hear that, so.
That's okay. I'll repeat it for you. So is there any work being done there on the plants to see how climate change would affect them?
Yeah, so that's one of the advantages of having long-term data. So I didn't go into this too much, but a lot of these monitoring projects actually started in the late 80s. So some of them are over 30 years old. Some of our more recent projects are only like 20 years old. And so a lot of the climate related research is a little bit more of looking for using this long-term trends, looking at what warm years do, what colder years do, what more rainy years do, and kind of looking at that more correlatively, and kind of projecting out into the future. And I see there's something in the chat. Florida rosemary, potential herbicide, pesticide, very allelopathic. I wouldn't exactly call it an herbicide or pesticide, but you're correct. It is very allelopathic. And that is another, I didn't mention this, but that's one of the reasons why some of these species are thought to be able to thrive there is because they either have tolerance to the allelopathy or just grow a certain way to avoid it. Some of our recent research has actually looked into whether those herbaceous plants have a real tolerance to it at the seed phase. And one of the things we've discovered is that some of the specialists out there, so the species that really are only found there, tend to be more tolerant of allelopathy than those that are generalists, so species that are found both there and other places. And that's probably due to their having seeds that are a little bit thicker and able to withstand that allelopathy. And then that actually translates then to that after that rosemary goes away, those seeds are just right there in the soil ready to go because they've been able to withstand that allelopathy. But yeah, that's a great point bringing that up. I didn't mention that today.
Anything else from the crowd? Okay, Aaron, I appreciate you. Oh wait, there's one more question from Ryan in the chat there.
Yeah, the question about trucking sand from Lake Hills Ridge for beach nourishment. I think I don't know enough about that to comment on that. I wouldn't be surprised if it's happening from our area, but I'm not the person to ask about that, unfortunately.
Awesome. Well, thanks for sharing with us, Aaron. It was super insightful. And I think Dustin's going to be leading the field trip on Saturday. Is that correct?
Yeah, unfortunately, I'm going to be already out of town for Thanksgiving, so I won't be able to be there. But I'll have at least one person from my program helping Dustin out. And I hope you guys those of you that are able to make it out have a wonderful trip and get to see the sites that we have at Archbold.
Yeah, and that'll be this Saturday. We'll start the field trip at 9 a.m., like an hour and a half east of here, so plan for that. And it's going to be a really cool trip. They've got some awesome plants out there. So thanks so much, Aaron.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
All right.